Welcome to another deep dive, folks. This one might just change the way you look at the world, at yourself even.
High stakes.
It is, it is.
Yeah.
We're diving into The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, a book that shook up evolutionary biology.
Yeah, really turned things upside down.
It really did.
Yeah.
And I guess the basic question is, are we really in control, or are we just, vehicles for our genes?
Vehicles. That's a great way to put it. You know, what Dawkins does is he kind of shifts the focus of evolution. So instead of looking at the survival of organisms, the animals, the plants, us,
Right, right.
he says, no, 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 it's the genes that are the real survival machines. We're just along for the ride.
Okay, so it's like a battle of the genes then, instead of organisms struggling to survive. That sounds a little brutal, right?
It does sound that way. I think the term selfish gene, it can be a little misleading. It's not like the genes have these little tiny brains and they're plotting and scheming.
Right.
It's more of a metaphor for how natural selection works. So genes that, help an organism survive and reproduce, those are the ones that are more likely to get passed on. It's like they have this selfish interest in their own survival, but again, it's not conscious.
So, okay, let me try and put this in my own words. Like a gene that makes a bird, say, build a really strong nest. That gene isn't thinking like, oh, I need to survive. It's just that the birds with that gene, they have more chicks.
Right.
And those chicks inherit the same nest-building gene, so it keeps going.
Exactly. Dawkins uses this example of hygienic bees, right? Some bees have a gene that makes them remove sick larvae from the hive.
Oh, okay.
Protects the colony. It's complex behavior, but that gene, it doesn't need to know anything about preventing disease.
Right.
It just so happens that those bees with that gene, they're more likely to survive. And of course, that means the gene itself survives too.
Okay, so we're talking about behavior, even really complex stuff, all driven by these tiny little bits of code. But how does this selfish gene idea explain, like, aggression or altruism? Like, why don't lions hunt lions? And why do birds risk their lives to protect their babies? It doesn't seem very selfish, right?
Yeah, that's where this idea of an evolutionarily stable strategy comes in. Dawkins, he calls it ESS for short, he uses this kind of simple model of hawks and doves to explain it.
Wait, so like actual birds. Are we going to talk about a bird fight club now?
Not quite. Imagine like two stags, they're competing for a mate, right? A hawk would be all aggressive,
Yeah.
charging in antlers first, ready for a fight. The dove might just, try and posture, roar a bit, but ultimately back down from a fight.
Okay, so in a world where all the stags are doves, wouldn't just one hawk totally dominate?
Exactly. It'd win every time, pass on those hawk genes all over the place. But think about a world full of hawks, right? Constant fighting, injuries, death. Not great for survival in the long run.
Right? Too many hawks is a problem. So is the solution just a world full of doves then?
The ESS, the stable strategy here, is actually a balance between the two. You need some hawks, some doves. Neither one can completely outcompete the other. You get a stable mix.
So it's like the doves, they actually help the hawks by preventing them from killing each other off, right?
Exactly. And this ESS thing, it applies to so many things, not just stags fighting. Think about like salary negotiations.
Okay,
If
yeah.
you go in too aggressive, too much of a hawk, it might backfire. But be too passive, like a dove, you might get undervalued.
I couldn't.
Got to find that balance,
Okay,
right?
it's
Yeah.
about knowing when to fight and when to back down. Okay, that makes sense. But doesn't this whole selfish gene thing mean everything is just competition then?
That's a really great question, and it takes us to this fascinating paradox in evolution, altruism. Like, how can a gene that promotes selfless behavior actually be good for its own survival? That's what we'll unpack next time.
Ooh, can't wait. See y'all next time. So last time, we left off with this big question. How can a selfish gene lead to behaviors that seem totally selfless? It's like, if it's all about survival of the fittest, why would any organism help another?
Yeah, it's a puzzle. Biologists wrestled with it for a long time, and Dawkins, he gives us an answer with this idea of kin selection. Think about it this way. Your genes, they aren't just in you, they're in your family too.
Okay, so like, helping my sister, even if it costs me something, could actually help some of the same genes that we both share.
Exactly. The closer the kinship, the more genes you have in common, and the more likely you are to see altruistic behavior.
Okay, so parents sacrificing for their kids, that makes sense. They're protecting their genes, essentially.
Right.
But what about siblings? I mean, we share genes too, but you don't see people throwing themselves in front of buses for their brother or sister every day.
That's true. It's a good point. And that brings up another factor, certainty. Parents, they can be much more certain that their kids carry their genes compared to, say, their siblings' kids.
So there's this like certainty factor that plays into how altruistic you are.
Precisely. And when it comes to yourself, that certainty factor is at 100%, right? Dawkins, he argues that this is why we see so much individual selfishness. It's stronger than just what genetics would predict because, well, you're 100% sure those are your genes on the line.
So even though I share, what, 50% of my genes with my brother, I'm going to prioritize my own survival because I know for sure those are my genes.
Exactly. But even with that certainty factor, kin selection can still be a really powerful force, you know? When the benefit to a relative is high enough and the cost to the individual is low enough, you're going to see altruistic behaviors evolve.
So it's like a cost-benefit analysis, but for your genes.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. And it helps explain why we see altruism more often in animals that live in these, tight-knit family groups.
Yeah.
Think about meerkats taking turns guarding the burrow, right?
Right.
The risk to any individual meerkat is small, but the benefit to the whole group, and therefore their shared genes, is huge.
So Dawkins is saying even those heartwarming examples of animals helping each other, it's really all about genes looking out for themselves. It's kind of a bummer, isn't it?
It might seem that way at first, but Dawkins argues that this perspective, it's not cynical, it's actually more realistic. It helps us to see, the underlying mechanics of how behavior works without resorting to these feel-good explanations that, don't really hold up when you look closely.
Okay, so maybe cynical isn't the right word.
Yeah.
But it does raise the question of how animals actually recognize their kin in the first place. Do they have, a gene-detecting superpower or something?
Wouldn't that be amazing? Dawkins, he talks about this thought experiment called the green beard effect. Imagine, right, a gene that codes for both a visible trait, let's say a green beard, and then also for altruistic behavior toward others with that same trait.
Oh, okay. So if you see another creature with a green beard, you know their family, and you help them out.
Exactly. But even Dawkins, he points out the flaws here. It's extremely unlikely that you'd have one single gene that controls both a physical trait and a complex behavior like that.
So green beards are out. How do they do it then? Do animals go around asking for family trees?
More likely, it's a combo of cues. Physical resemblance, that's one, especially in species where offspring look a lot like their parents.
Right, but that's not always reliable, is it? Especially in bigger groups where not everyone who looks alike is actually related.
Exactly. And another cue is familiarity. Animals that grow up together, even if they aren't actually closely related, they often form bonds and show altruistic behaviors.
So it's like those stories of a dog and cat raised together that become best friends.
Right.
They're not kin, but they have this family bond because they grew up together.
Exactly. And for some animals, location is a key factor. Birds that nest in colonies, for example.
Right.
High probability that your neighbors are also your relatives, so helping them out makes sense from a gene's eye view.
So even if they can't be 100% sure, the odds are in their favor. It's like a calculated risk.
Precisely. Dawkins, he gives examples of whales rescuing members of their pod, baboons defending their troop. Even without that individual recognition, the statistical probability of helping a relative is often high enough to make it worthwhile.
So it's like, I'm not sure if that's my cousin, but there's a good chance it is, so I'll help out just in case.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that brings us to a really interesting question. How do human societies, with our complex social structures, how do we handle this challenge of kin recognition? We don't rely on, scent or location like other animals do.
Well, we have things like last names, family trees, genealogical records, heck, even DNA testing these days.
Yeah, right.
We've gone to a lot of trouble to figure out our family connection.
We have. And those systems, they're complex, but they serve the same fundamental purpose as those simpler cues that other animals use. They help us figure out who's kin, and in a way, they guide how we interact with each other.
It's amazing to think that even with all our technology and culture, those basic gene-driven strategies might still be at work.
It really makes you think, right? But our deep dive isn't done yet. We've talked about how kin selection can drive altruism. Now let's look at another fascinating aspect of family dynamics, the potential for conflict.
Oh, things are about to get juicy. I'm ready. All right, so we've covered how selfish genes can push both aggression and altruism, especially within families. But families, they aren't always these perfect little units, are they?
No, definitely not. I mean, think sibling rivalry, parents playing favorites. We humans and even our animal relatives, we can get pretty messy,
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how does this whole selfish gene idea explain all that conflict? Should a mother purely from an evolutionary perspective, should she treat all her kids equally?
Well, it's not about, fairness in our human sense. Remember, it's all about maximizing the chances of those genes being passed on. Dawkins makes this distinction between childbearing decisions, whether to reproduce at all, and childcaring decisions, like how much to invest in the kids you already have.
So deciding to have a baby, that's one thing. But deciding how much time and energy you put into raising that baby, that's a whole separate calculation.
Exactly. And sometimes those calculations, they lead to strategies that seem a little, well, harsh. Imagine a bird, right? Nest full of chicks. Food is scarce. From a gene's perspective, putting more effort into the older, stronger chicks might make the most sense.
So it's like playing favorites, but based on who's got the best chance of surviving and, passing those genes on.
Yeah, kind of like that. It's about maximizing that return on investment, but from the gene's point of view. The younger chicks, they might be out of luck, at least for now. But if things get better, the parents might switch back to giving them more resources.
Okay, but isn't that the opposite of the group selection idea we talked about before?
Yeah.
Shouldn't a parent try to help all their offspring for the good of the species?
Dawkins argues that family planning, it's much more about individual success than this idea of sacrificing for the group. He gives this great example of red grouse. They have these territories, seemingly with more food than they need, but only the territory owners actually get to breed.
Oh, interesting. So why don't the other grouse, the ones without territories, why don't they fight harder for one? Don't their genes want to be passed on?
They do. But remember, even behavior that looks selfless often has a selfish gene explanation underneath it all. Those outcast grouse, they might be better off just waiting for a territory owner to die, rather than wasting all their energy in a fight. They're probably going to lose.
So it's a gamble, but maybe a smarter gamble than just constantly fighting.
Right, and that waiting strategy, it might actually be more successful in the long run. It shows how even when things look like self-sacrifice, there's often those individual genes pulling the strings.
Man, this selfish gene perspective really messes with our nice, cozy ideas about family. Huh.
It definitely challenges some of our assumptions, but you got to remember, Dawkins isn't saying we're just robots controlled by our genes. He's offering a way to understand these deep evolutionary forces that shape our behavior.
So it's not about denying our emotions or our capacity for altruism. It's more about understanding that there's this deeper biological layer that might be influencing our actions.
Exactly. And it brings up some really interesting questions, like if genes are the basic units of selection, are there other levels of selection going on too? Can groups of, cooperative individuals, even with some selfishness mixed in, can they outcompete groups that are totally selfish? That question of group selection versus individual selection, that's something biologists are still working on today.
This whole deep dive has been seriously mind-blowing. I feel like I'm seeing the world, and especially family dynamics, in a whole new light.
That's the power of Dawkins' work, It makes us look beyond the surface and see that complex dance between genes and behavior. Who knows what other hidden strategies are out there waiting to be discovered?
Lots to think about. Well, thanks for taking us on this an incredible journey into the selfish gene. It's given us a lot to chew on.
And to all our listeners out there, keep questioning, keep exploring. There's a whole universe of amazing knowledge out there waiting to be discovered.